All right, I'm gonna invite up Ken Mbugua. I got it right, didn't I? That's right. It's impressive. What we want to do, here's what we're going to do. We're going to just get to know Ken, hear a little bit of his story, and I'll kind of lead us in a little Q&A, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you have questions, just kind of mark them down on your paper or in your head, and it'll give you a chance to kind of share those in a little bit. Well, Ken, first just introduce yourself.
First of all, before my name, I have to apologize for wearing sneakers on a Sunday morning. It's important as you're trying to get to know Ken doesn't normally wear sneakers on a Sunday morning. I was a bit too comfortable in the house I stayed at last that I walked right past my shoes, and they looked just nice next to the door. That's why I'm wearing sneakers today. My name is Ken Mbugua. I hail from Nairobi, Kenya. I am married to one Arlette Mbugua, and we are blessed to have three adorable kids, aged 6, 4, and 2.
So how did you come to know the Lord Jesus?
I attended church most of my life. Used to go to a Presbyterian church where they might or might not have preached the gospel. I don't remember hearing it there. At age 14, we moved to a different part of the city, and I began attending an independent fundamental Baptist church that was across the road because my dad required it. And it's there that I got introduced to the gospel. It was, I call it a very anti-Catholic gospel. It really emphasized salvation by faith alone and by grace alone and not by works. But in its emphasis, it kind of downplayed repentance in many ways, or even the fruit of genuine conversion. So for a long time, even though I knew the gospel, I was deceived that I was a Christian, simply because I had assented to the gospel mentally. And what was emphasized was simply, if you've prayed the prayer, you're saved. And it doesn't matter really what is showing up in your life. So myself and many other people in the church, I think, were false converts for quite a while. When I was about to finish high school, I had someone talk about the fact that Lord is not Christ's third name. He actually is Lord over all who follow him, speaking about Christ as King. And it became clear to me then that he wasn't my king. He wasn't my Lord, because my life didn't reflect that in any way. I didn't really care what Jesus thought. All I had was a mental assent in my head about the gospel, but my life was filled with the fruit of the flesh. The friends who knew me actually would joke, because I'd say I'm a Christian, and they'd say, Ken, if you are going to heaven, Ken, then there'll be no one in hell. That's the kind of testimony my life was bringing forth. But the Lord was gracious enough to help me come to that realization that indeed I was a false convert. I was making a profession that had no evidence in my soul. And once that became clear, all I wanted to do was become a Christian. And I believed the same gospel that was taught in my church, that Christ had died for sinners such as I, for hypocrites such as I. And the Lord converted me then. And my life significantly changed from that point.
Now you said it was your dad made you go to church. Is that common in Kenya that people are regularly kind of involved in the church?
Yeah, so Kenya is a country that's filled with nominal Christianity, a Christianity that is evidenced by the fact that you identify with a certain denomination, and people do that as families. And so it's very typical for you to hear a family saying, no, we are Anglicans, or we are Baptists, or we are fill in the blank. And it becomes almost an obligation. You don't kind of betray what your family is in that regard. So going to church is very, very common in where I'm from. And in most churches, I would say conversion is not really emphasized. And when you combine the nominal Christianity that makes church going normative, but then the fact that most churches do not really have any meaningful membership, it becomes very easy for you to fill up the pews with people who think they're Christians, but actually they're not.
So I know that you can't speak to all of Africa, right? I mean, you have some knowledge of the rest of the continent, primarily in Kenya, and then more specifically in Nairobi.
Yeah.
What is the obviously, Kenya itself would probably identify largely as Christians. What is the general theological foundation of most churches, most people in Kenya?
That's a good question. So with the traditional denominations, Anglican, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, what you really have is missionaries came in and converts were realized, and churches under those denominational titles were established. But in many cases, very weak foundations were laid, even for those churches. So I have a friend of mine who's a Presbyterian, and he normally just is pained by the fact that the Scottish Presbyterians who came and founded the church many, many years ago now chose to use the shorter Westminster Catechism as opposed to the full deal. And what was most probably a prudent decision then, or wise, namely education was low, literacy was low, and so it was, I think, more of a decision that was a bit pragmatic of deciding, let's kind of do as little as we can, which we'll call today a dumbed down version of the confessions. It basically led to churches that were not very doctrinally serious, churches that did not view those foundational documents that established them as critical. And so those documents lost their place very, very quickly. So it's very typical for you to have churches, especially in that world, including the Baptists, who have founding documents that are pretty good if you look at them. Church covenant, for example, a statement of faith. But those are documents the members of the church have never seen. The pastors who came after have never consulted those documents. So the church has become something that is very atheological. It's almost agnostic when it comes to what is our theology. So churches don't even divide on the basis of doctrine. Churches divide more on the basis of tradition. We're different, our pastors dress different, our liturgies are different. It's things like that mainly, not so much we actually have, we part ways on this theological point. That's what churches in Kenya. So very weak theological foundations is what we describe most churches in Africa as.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about that. So the average church, obviously we know that some things coming from the States are going to Africa, so some things we experience here would be there, maybe at a different degree. Tell us a little bit more about the prosperity gospel, charismatic, because a lot of things we may hear here in the States, we would hear that Christianity in the global South, South America, in Africa is booming and growing, right? And sometimes we don't always know what version of Christianity that may be. So when you kind of look at the landscape, theological landscape of Kenya and maybe broadly Africa, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so it's good back-to-back questions because they're very related. Because the churches in Africa have a very kind of shaky foundation, or almost just hardly any theological foundation. The churches became very vulnerable to false teaching. Members, the Ephesians 4 model of the pulpit is for the purpose of equipping the saints for the work of the ministry, pursuing a vision of seeing people strengthened in such a way that they are no longer tossed to and fro by any wind of doctrine. That's not the vision for churches in Africa. So because they're just growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but they're very, very shallow, it means when the prosperity gospel just came in, it swept across the continent. Now we say, not only do you have the Pentecostal churches that oftentimes, in my context, also are prosperity gospel preaching, but you have the same things, the charismatic elements and also the prosperity gospel affecting the traditional denominations. So many Baptists in the Southern Baptist work, so the IMB, the group of churches planted with the BCOK, the Baptist churches of Kenya. So many of those churches will preach the prosperity gospel. They'll have either a very hardcore version of it, or a light version of it. And again, it's because even though they are Baptists in name, they had very shallow theological foundations. And so when the society around them is going one direction, the churches just head that direction. Because it's seen more as a style. It's not viewed as a, hey, this is doctrinally a different path we're taking. No, it's almost like a fad. Like now we all wear jeans, or now we all, so this is the new thing. The new thing is, this is what we preach, and this is how we have services. And so churches move without much of a problem. And the connection there again is really important, because it kind of tells you about what the future might look like. I pray it doesn't look like this. Because when feminism really was strong, like came up strongly in the 90s, and it became like a thing in Kenya, where there was NGOs that were promoting feminism. The church, you woke up and it was egalitarian. Like one day we were complementarian. All the Presbyterian, Anglican, AIC, like you go through the main, they were all complementarian. And then the society shifted. And what the church did, you woke up the next morning and the church had shifted and everybody had female pastors. And it was never a fight. It was never a theological argument about what do these verses here by Paul mean, because that's how things happen here. People try and explain things in Ephesians, the gifts are, separated from qualifications. That's not the case in Kenya, and in most of Africa. It's simply the culture has shifted, the church has shifted with it, and it's all because of our very weak theological roots. So yeah, the broad description of what the church in Africa would be would not be something that we want to celebrate necessarily. There's true believers in many, many churches, including even prosperity gospel preaching churches. There's true believers in there. But the growth of the church in the global south, at least as far as Africa is concerned, I wouldn't say it's something to really be shouting from the rooftops. It's something to be concerned about.
So when I went to Africa to visit Ken's church, got a chance to sit down with his elders, and meet many of his people. And what you see there is very different than what I was hearing about happening in the rest of Africa. A lot of the things that are happening there would be things that we would affirm and rejoice in happening here and other like-minded churches. So growing up in that kind of theological landscape, right, how did you become a little bit different, kind of moving more towards sound doctrine and trying to biblical fidelity?
Yeah, so when I became a Christian, I went back to my pastor and I told him I want to get baptized. I had already been baptized, but I knew I wasn't baptized because I was not a Christian. And I still remember the argument with my pastor. He's like, you're making a big fuss out of nothing. I'm like, but I was not converted. He's like, you most probably were. So just emphasizing how even in my church, the pastor just didn't quite care very much about a biblical understanding of conversion. Fast forward a couple of years, somebody comes to Kenya and they're teaching through the 9 marks of a healthy church. This was about in 2006. So I imagine the book was not very old at that point. So as they're teaching through it, a biblical understanding of conversion really struck me. So the doctrine of election was taught very clearly from the scriptures. And I remember just seeing how big God's love is, that it pursued me before I had the mind to pursue him. And that really staggered me. And just the fact that nobody mentioned Calvinism, just people were just like, look at this verse, look at this verse, look at this verse. And I was like, yeah, this is clearly taught in the text. And then the second thing I caught from that book was a biblical understanding of, or rather just expository preaching. And first of all, struck me as a really weird concept, but opened a new way of looking at the scriptures for me. Went to do my studies, believed I was called to the ministry, pastors affirmed it. Went to do my studies in Zambia. Came across Desiring God by John Piper. Came across a brother called Conrad Mbewe. And Conrad was a huge influence on me. Not personally, but just by seeing the work that he had done, or God had done through him in Zambia. So being in a country, Zambia is a very peculiar country in Africa. Being in a country that had dozens and dozens of healthy churches. So they're reformed. And they're churches that have been under local leadership for multiple decades. So really the boom and the spread of sound teaching and healthy churches came under local people. So it wasn't missionaries necessarily who were doing that work in Zambia. Missionaries were there maybe in the mid 70s, but I'm showing up in the mid 2000s, and just being blown away by another way, for another path of preaching, another view of what the local church can be. And by the time I'm finishing up my studies, I'm fully convinced. Not only because of what I started seeing in the 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, or the world I was introduced to by Desiring God, the book by John Piper, but also by what was clearly manifested in front of me of churches that were birthed out of strong biblical preaching. Now, there's other things there that I think I learned later that really kind of make for what a healthy church is. But by the time I'm going back home, those things had really influenced me.
So you're going back home and you landed at Emmanuel Baptist Church. Tell us a little bit about that call there and how the church is doing now.
Yeah, so I landed back in 2010 in Nairobi, Kenya, and very discouraged at that point because in some ways I'm feeling like there's not what I've seen in Zambia is absent in Kenya, but just encouraged by the work of the Lord from 2010 till now. So broad landscape and then specifically with EBC. When I come back home, I find
EBC is Emmanuel Baptist Church.
The church I serve as a pastor in. When I come back home, Emmanuel Baptist Church is still an independent fundamental Baptist church. So that's not the church I used to be in, but I was called to serve there as a youth pastor. But it had a really good pastor, godly brother. We disagreed on so many things, multiplicity of elders, Calvinism. So he would say, Ken, that's your stuff. When you become lead pastor, you can do all those things. But right now I'm the lead pastor, so that's not how we are sailing this ship. So which I really appreciated. Very kind. He's like a father figure to me till now. But so EBC is like that, and there's really no Reformed churches that I know of. There's one very strongly 1689 church on the other side of the city. But since then till now, the church scene has really changed, and not through our efforts as Emmanuel Baptist Church, or singularly. Partly, but not singularly by any measure. Now, as I sit here, I'd say there's maybe 25 churches in the city that I could point people to. They're not all Baptists, but they're all going to fit in under the Reformed Catholicity umbrella, which is very encouraging to me. From like only one that I knew of, Trinity Baptist Church, to like 25 different ones. So the Lord is clearly at work. And even though we are a drop in the ocean, an ocean filled with churches that are not necessarily like-minded, the growth as far as healthy churches is, to me, just nothing but evidence of the Spirit's work. And especially because it is not credited to any one individual, but a very broad kind of movement that's happening. 2014, I did my internship at Capitol Hill Baptist Church, where I also found my wife. It was a very fruitful internship. And 2015, the year after, I was called as lead pastor of the church. And by then the church knew the direction I was going to head. I'd been preaching 50% of the sermons for maybe 3-4 years before I became lead pastor. So the congregation was familiar with my convictions. The direction we were headed was just very evident. So after a short while, it was the members themselves who were asking about multiplicity of elders. You've taught us this for so long. When are we going that direction? Church discipline. You've taught us this for quite a while. When are we going that direction? Because you had documents like the church covenant, it was very easy to pull it out and simply say, this document is not my document. I didn't come up with it. This is a foundational document of this church. We just began using it in our members' meetings to continue to promote meaningful membership amongst the saints. So the Lord was pleased to bless all of those efforts. And the church, I think, in many ways was transformed. I was also very blessed to have people in the pews who agreed with the things I was saying. So the revitalization effort there was simpler than what I hear from so many brothers as they engage in revitalization work. So we had people cheering you on from the pews, and that just makes the process much, much smoother. So yeah, we were, the Lord blessed our desires to plant churches. To date, we've planted, I think, 5 churches, and they're all, for the most part, doing well. There's one of them that's kind of struggling, It's in an area called Kajiado, but the brother is still a dear brother. He's faithful. He's proclaiming the gospel. But we most probably need to guide him in different ways. So thankful for the work that the Lord is continuing to do in the city.
And one of those was really recent?
One of those was last Sunday. They are having their fast. They had their fast meeting as a congregation today. So dear brother John Musimi, he came to our church with a desire to go and plant fairly quickly, but then he lost his wife in 2020, and so that really slowed down everything. And then he, by God's grace, got married again, and then this year he lost a child. But the Lord strengthened both he and his wife, and they decided to continue on the same path. So all the things we're speaking about, it's interesting that they're not just, there's so many bumps on the road, there's so many difficulties, there's so many challenges that the Lord allows to humble us and to make us dependent on him and to make it clear, as it says in 2 Corinthians, that the power that is on display in Nairobi is not from us. It is clearly from him. It is treasures that are in jars of clay. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask a series of more questions, and I'm going to open it up to you. So this plant that went out with 100 people from the congregation on an average Sunday morning. They had about 500 now, about maybe 400 on a Sunday morning. Yeah. But now you have 5 elders because you sent out 2.
Yeah, we have 3 elders now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We used to be 6. One had to step down because he finished his 2 years of 2 terms, and then 2 went out.
Okay. So one of the things that when you're thinking about partnering with other churches and seeing what God's work is, you're starting to think about a little bit of the gospel infrastructure, right? You're not just thinking about, hey, we want to have a healthy gospel preaching church, but how do we create other healthy gospel preaching churches all throughout the city, all throughout the country, all throughout the continent? So you have done some things that are unique, right, in hoping to try to impact some of that gospel infrastructure. So what are the things that you have done specifically as kind of like ministries that have flown out of EBC? Yeah,
so the internship was very impactful to me. And one of the things I remember thinking in the last elders meeting, where we were all supposed to come and share something around the table, I remember thinking, the stuff I've seen here is not unique to Washington, D.C. It's like they do not have a corner in the market as far as healthy church. This is not Mark Dever. This is the Bible. This is what all followers of Jesus, all spirit-filled churches can hope for and even pursue. And so I went back home with a strong desire to see that happen. I was thoroughly impacted by the fact that there was really no lectures during the internship. We just were given a whole stack of books and like abandoned to ourselves. You write papers. Mark doesn't really tell you anything during the discussions. He's just kind of guiding you along for the most part. Socratic discussion. So the Socratic approach to teaching is kind of what they do there, which is leading the students to self-discovery as opposed to telling them what the answer is. So I went home feeling like we could most probably serve many brothers if we had good books. So we went back home and we set up a publishing company called Ecclesia Africa. The desire there was to address the problem of a lack of access to theological resources in our context. So I remember meeting with Crossway in Wheaton, Illinois, and them basically telling me, hey, every single time we've given out copyrights to Africans, they just kind of go missing. We never hear back from them again. Books get printed, not a proper accountability. So there wasn't an abundance of trusted publishers that Western companies could be able to partner with to make resources available. Up till then, in my context, most of the books were either flown in or shipped in, which is a highly inefficient way to serve a very broad church. So in setting up a publishing company, we were able to sign copyright agreements to the books we wanted, which allowed us to print the books locally. So some of the smaller books, like the Rainbow series, as we call it, or the very colorful series of 9 Max books, Church Membership, Church Discipline, we were printing those books for $1.50 in Kenya. And even if we sell them at twice the price, which is about $3, to help cover expenses, it was still way cheaper than what it's sold for on Amazon here in the US. So in doing that, books became more available. But then we also saw the great need for pastors to get some training. The statistic in Africa, and this will sound like a ridiculous start, but it is 8 to 9. Out of every 10 pastors in Africa, 8 to 9 of them do not have access to formal theological training. So that's 80 to 90%. And our experience on the ground has been like that when we've met up with other groups doing non-formal theological training or just kind of grassroots training. That stat holds up. So most pastors don't have access to books or training for the work of the ministry. There's going to be little pockets of workshops here and there, and pastors will get a certificate at the end of it, but nothing structured and disciplined and sufficiently long. So we organized the books that we were getting into topics. So the first 3 books are going to be about helping the pastor develop a word-based philosophy of ministry, to just believe it's all in the word. Like don't try and do tricks. Open up the scriptures to your people. Allow them to interact with them. The power is in the word. So that's the first 3 books. The next 3 books are about expository preaching. They're about the ecclesiology. So what is a local church? What is a healthy church? So we were surprised, actually, as people are going through our program. Something we were not trying to get done. But so many pastors coming back to us and saying, we have never observed the Lord's table, which is a really strange thing. You're like, wait, you're a local church. What do you mean you've never observed the Lord? It's just, it didn't occur to them. They know it's in the Bible, but this again just shows you how churches are just so much about something different. It's a group that gathers every week to be impressed with something the pastor will say or do. So in prosperity gospel preaching churches, there's just a low view on the ordinances. And then we do pastoral theology. So dangerous calling is inside of that, and some other counseling tools. And that's because in Africa you have a big man, the man of God syndrome, we call it, where the church is really centered around a big figure that has superpowers and very impressive leadership. And so we were trying to change the model and the view of what is the job of a pastor, and for it to be more, smell like the sheep, spend time with your people. So that's critical in my context. And then systematic biblical theology, and then missions as well. So all those are books. The pastors get a book a month. They sit down as a group. They have study questions. You read the book. You fill out the study questions. Then you show up for a meeting with other pastors who have done the same thing. And then we give them discussion questions. And they discuss them amongst themselves. So there's a cohort leader. And then different cohorts arranged under a network leader. Different networks arranged under a regional leader. And then to the team in Nairobi. So, yeah.
So one of the things that typically happens when you start a program like that, you don't really know where it's going to go, right? Hey, listen, we want to get good books into pastors' hands so they can have some training. So let's publish the books here so we can afford it, and let's just give it to pastors and let's have them talk about it. And then what you see happening is, this program is called SOMA, right, where we want to systematically, monthly read these books with the pastors, with a mentor. And now, all throughout Kenya and Tanzania, how many pastors are a part of this?
We have about 1,200 pastors in the program right now.
So 1,200 pastors, right? Just with a simple idea, we just want to give pastors these books, right? So incredible. And I was able to talk to a number of these pastors and say, hey, listen, how has this program helped you? He said, I had to apologize to my people because I was doing the wrong thing, right? And I've heard those stories directly from the pastors that we interacted with. And the program is just doing tremendous things. So the SOMA program, Ecclesiastica, books, knowing that there's going to be a greater need to have Africans lead the way theologically ahead. What is the new endeavor these last several years?
Yeah, so very recently as last year, the end of last year, we started a seminary. So one of the difficulties in my context is where there are students who actually have the capacity to engage in rigorous academic study in preparation for the ministry, there's not going to be very many schools that will be able to stretch them and actually thoroughly equip them for that work. So I had to leave Kenya to go all the way to Zambia in pursuit of just a decent school that I could prepare for the ministry in. And the school has become better, but even then, to be honest, the education I received as far as my seminary training was pretty low. I still remember refusing to fill in a quiz because the quiz was to list the days of creation and what God created. And I remember telling my lecturer, I was like, we came from Kenya to Zambia because we desire to be equipped for the work of the ministry. And this is Sunday school level stuff you're giving us. And that was a protest. It might sound bad, but many people who desire to get well equipped are flying out of Africa to try and come here to your RTS, your SEBTS, your SBTS, your Westminster Theological Seminary, because there's a certain level of education that's really not available. South Africa has a school or two that are pretty good. Very difficult to get into South Africa and get like a student's permit to study. So that's not like open to the continent. So by God's grace, we got a really good professor, because I can't teach at that school. I want people who can teach me. I want the kind of school where I cannot be a professor. And so God gave us a brother called Michael Christ. He's a PhD, really solid PhD at that. And we were able to bring in other resources that were locally available. Our brother from Wheaton called Jamie Vyans, PhD from in the Old Testament. And then getting adjunct professors who are flying in to come and help equip our people. So Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary in Michigan were happy to partner with us and allow us to teach half their classes on the ground. So with their MA, their Masters of Arts in Biblical Studies, the brothers on the ground who are teaching are actually teaching classes that are recognized by that school as that, which is a big deal for us. It's not just like an online program. Here's an online program study to get a degree, but it's face-to-face, at least 50% of it, and then the other 50%, they go online for that. And then because it's Presbyterian and we're Baptists, we add more classes to make it a full MDiv. So I was about to say the kids, the brothers graduate with an MDiv that is unaccredited, that has ecclesiology. Mark Deva is coming to teach the practical ecclesiology class next year in April. And then an accredited MA from PRTS. So that's a huge thing for us. So just to give you a hint of how huge it is, when the classes were starting, we came up with a little breakdown of what the units will be. And we sent them around on WhatsApp because we were kind of late. No marketing, WhatsApp messaging. Deadline is in 4 days, kind of a thing. Like, this is a terrible idea. This is not how you do student recruitment. The next week, I had people call me from Nigeria and say, brother, there's 2 of the guys who've been in my little institute who want to quit and come to Kenya to join this thing. This is what they've been looking for. But brothers in Uganda do the same thing. A whole bunch of people in a seminary, the biggest college in East and Central Africa is called Africa International University. There's a buzz amongst the students who just clearly see this is really the quality of education we desire. So the student recruitment portion, I don't think it will be difficult. The rigor of the classes is what really the challenge is. That it kind of requires most of the students to be full-time. And in Kenya, you don't really have a setup like what you have here in the US, where you can kind of take a part-time job and also be a part-time student. Most jobs in Kenya are going to be full-time, period. So if somebody's working full-time, it's going to be really difficult for them to actually do the classes as they're required to be done. But finally, we do have a very good quality program that is being rolled out in Nairobi. The school is called Nairobi Institute of Reformed Theology. It's a mouthful, and the acronym doesn't really work because it's NERT, which sounds really weird.
It does.
But that's where we're starting off.
You can just say, get your nerd on. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it up to you guys, and then I'm going to need 2 mic runners. So Heath and Dayling, if you could be mic runners, that'd be great. What are some just challenges that you face that as we think about you that we could be lifting up in prayer?
Yeah, pray for more elders at the church. We are 3 of us. We need another 15. So you can ask for grace there. We as elders could have done a better job of that in the years past. But pray for elders. It is our number 1, 2, and 3 greatest need as a congregation.
Okay, well, any questions that you have? Yes, Keith Doster over here. See, our mic runners, sometimes our mic walkers. It's okay. It's all good.
Brother, what is the influence of Islam on the nation and on the church?
So Islam is a growing threat, where in the past they would have been termed as being 10% of the nation. That number is growing. I think they're now more like 15%. Secondly, because of the war in Somalia, we have an unusual number of Somali migrants in the country. So the Islam that is there has been strengthened by the influx of the Somalis into the country. But then thirdly, the kind of Islam that is growing is the radical type of Islam that is growing. So our church, because of that, and an incident that happened in trying to care for a brother who was being persecuted in another country and we were housing him, we received a threat at our doorstep. Someone dropped a letter early in the morning and threatened to, let's just say, cause a lot of damage because of minors in the room in the church. And it was a credible letter. And the anti-terror police who came were like, yeah, this is actually a cell group that's live in the city. And they're actively engaging with it. But that just means that the type of Islam in the city is radicalized, and it's continuing to tend that way. They, as far as missions work goes, they're being very aggressive. They have taken the model of the early missionaries who came to Africa. They go to places that are unengaged, or at least not very well served with gospel churches, and they open schools, they open hospitals, and they make those services particularly available to Muslims, to just woo the community towards them. They do the same thing in the poorest areas in Nairobi. So they have a very clear strategy that they are deploying, and it is a very well-funded strategy. So in Kenya, it's not untypical to go to a place that is not very developed and to see a fully built mosque that's sitting there waiting for the people to come. So they have really thought about the way to do it, and they're not in Nairobi jostling amongst where our churches are. They are going after the poorer communities and the unreached areas and establishing themselves there. So my tribe is Kikuyu, because of when the missionaries came in originally, the colonial government divided the denominations in accordance to tribes. So the Seventh-day Adventists were sent to the Kisii. The Presbyterians were sent to the Kikuyu, my tribe. So it's not normal that you come across people in my tribe belonging to other denominations. Now I am coming across many Kikuyus who are Muslim, which is just a really weird thing for us. You're like, wait, how did you even come across Islam? Your dad was obviously not Islamic. Like we typically don't live in places where there's even a Muslim person. So they're very aggressive, and it's also becoming more and more hostile.
So, brother, this is like a 13-part question. I'll try to bring it down to one. So you've spoken about Zambia, about even Nigeria, Kenya, obviously, Tanzania. So what language are we talking about there? What, is that Swahili or what is that? And then in the Kenya context, about how many ethnic groups or language groups are there? How many of those would you consider reached? And if you understand what I'm driving at.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, when you talk about Africa, one of the huge graces we have is most of the countries on the continent will be covered under two languages, French and English. Now that does not mean everybody in those countries speaks those languages, but it means that there are very many people in those countries who speak those languages. The only other language to add is really Portuguese, and you've covered almost all of them. So even the Arabic nations up north, and in the north part of Africa, many of them speak French. Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, French is acceptable there. In most of the French-speaking part of the continent, evangelical churches will be very weak. So Catholicism is stronger there, and it might be because of a French influence. And this evangelical work is exceedingly weak. when you speak about Kenya specifically, there's 42 tribes, as we call them. If you look at the Joshua Project, they will identify some smaller tribes as being unreached still. My experience has been even tribes that they say are reached, say the Samburu, for example. There's places not too far away from Nairobi where you will find massive swaths of the Samburu living in places where they don't have access to the gospel. So there's a town, maybe I'd say 6 hours drive from Nairobi. It's a little village called Ngurunit, and there's like a row of huge hills. They're not quite mountains, but huge hills that have made the region behind Ngurunit totally inaccessible. So it's very, very difficult to get there. The brother in that village was sharing with me that just a couple of years ago, they made it back there and they were talking to people in those villages who had never heard the name Jesus. So that the stats we get from the Joshua Project are generally useful, but specifically inaccurate. So there's still multiple tribes and people groups in the country and even regions that are yet to be properly engaged with the gospel.
Any other questions? Yes, John.
I was curious, I guess it's kind of a two-part question. What is the intersection between religion and politics in Kenya? Do you see, some political parties drifting way away from Christianity, or some being drifted, more in line with our doctrines? And then the second part of that is, are y'all experiencing a similar sexual revolution in Kenya like we are here?
Yeah, so I would start off by saying the way politics and the church intersect might be different from the way I see that intersecting here in the US, at least to some degree. There might be some overlap, but I think a lot of differences. When you come to the big denominations, Presbyterian, Anglican, etc., many of the older guys, now they're older because they went to university in the 60s and the 70s, many of them came here to get their training. But when they came here to get their training in the 60s and the 70s, what they found here in the schools that they went to was liberalism. It was rife. So when they came back to Kenya, they came back with a very different skewed view of what the church ought to be about. It's not about the conversion of souls and the discipling, the making of disciples. It had a lot to do with a social revolution. They ate up a lot of what had affected Brazil back in those days, a liberation theology. And they brought that stuff back home. But what that meant is there was a lot of engagement between church leaders and the government. It was church leaders that were leading protests on the streets against the government. So the government making concessions basically means wooing in and bringing in the church into decisions it's making, et cetera, et cetera. At the whole time, the churches are growing weaker and weaker theologically. And it's led to what has happened really today, as far as a very, very weak church. So what that gave birth to was a lot of interaction between the church and the state. So you'll typically have church leaders hold conferences to address, the nation on what is happening. So that's kind of the vision there. We don't quite have a Christian nationalism vibe going on in Kenya, but you have a lot of weird relationships between the church and the state. So the current government is very big on religion. They campaigned on that. Both of the president and the deputy president, their wives are both pastors. Their wives are both bishops in the church. The sad thing is they're of the hardcore prosperity gospel type. So it's all miracles, it's all declaring things. So when he became president, it's like at the White House. Every Sunday, there used to be meetings, church gatherings with pastors from all over coming to the White House or our State House to have church services. So it's a very weird kind of relationship that is highly unhealthy because it's married who God is and what the gospel is with the president. And so any corruption scandal, any drama happening in government is all attributed to, look at the church people, because that's who he has portrayed himself to be. That's who the wives have portrayed themselves to be. So there's there's not a healthy separation in my context between church and state. And then with the LGBTQ and the transgender conversation, it's a matter of generations in my context. The older generation would see it clearly as wrong. President Obama came for a tour across Africa, and he spoke about the LGBTQ agenda pretty strongly, and the president very publicly rebuked him and said, we don't really have a place for that here. This is not African. Many people cheered that, especially even here, which I didn't really put much credit to what he was saying, because he said it's not really African. I don't know what African is. African is changing every day, because African is watching Netflix every day. So what's happening is, as soon as African is no longer against LGBTQ, then we will have it. And so what you're having is the older generation able to speak like the president did and say, this is not our culture, this is not who we are. But the younger generation are already questioning it. So people who are under the age of 20, because of the strong influence of the media, they have a very different opinion about the LGBTQ than what their parents do. So within one generation, I think we're expecting to see a massive shift in the society when it comes to this question. So at Emmanuel Baptist Church, our teens group is going to be made up of many new parents, many new members who've come in. And when the brother who leads our youth group meetings engages the students on that, they do not have the same foundation as what we have. They're functioning from a very different, almost kind of worldview on this question. So we expect a lot of changes to happen. There's a friend of mine who's a Presbyterian. His youth pastor had a youth convention with multiple teens from different churches coming. And when he spoke on the issue, the kids booed him off of stage. Now, that's a very conservative group in kind of a rural area. But that kind of gives me the sense of, I think there's a storm brewing in the whole nation as far as this conversation goes. And I feel like things will shift very, very quickly when they shift. I hope that does not happen. But it's kind of my pessimistic outlook.
Well, there you have it, guys. Looking forward to many things happening in Africa in the days ahead. We'll be praying for you for sure. Well, we're going to sing one last song. I'll pray for us, and then we'll break, and then give some time to just kind of have a little bit transition time before the service at 10:30. If you want to just stand, we're going to sing hymn 317.